In this video, we continue our discussion on Chapter 14. When in our last video, we developed the money market and established the link between the money supply and aggregate demand. In today's video, we seek to develop expansionary monetary policy by considering some preliminaries in order to go over expansionary monetary policy and then conclude with some constraints on the tool. Where, beginning with our preliminaries, our current tasks at hand for monetary policy include developing the money market, establishing the link between the money supply and aggregate demand, and developing monetary policy itself. Where in our last video we developed the money market in order to see how interest rates were determined as well as the quantity of money, where our explanation was due to money demand and money supply. Interest rates and the quantity of money were determined at the intersection of money demand and money supply. Where, additionally, we also established the link between the money supply and aggregate demand, where we attributed this link being the interest rate, where if the Federal Reserve increases the money supply, this would then have the effect of decreasing the interest rate in equilibrium in the money market, where with a decline in the interest rate, this would have the effect of increasing investment. With an increase in investment, aggregate demand then increases, where if aggregate demand increases, real output and the average price level increase in the aggregate product market. Alternatively, if the Federal Reserve decides to decrease the money supply, this would then have the effect of increasing the interest rate in equilibrium for the money market, where with an increase in the interest rate, this has the effect of decreasing investment. With a decrease in investment, aggregate demand decreases, where if aggregate demand decreases, then real output and the average price level decline in the aggregate product market. Where the chain of events in terms of the Federal Reserve increasing and decreasing the money supply affecting the aggregate product market describes monetary policy precisely, where recall our definition for monetary policy was the use of money and credit controls to influence macroeconomic outcomes, where additionally, similar to what we did with fiscal policy in terms of breaking it up in terms of expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy, we can do the same for monetary policy, where expansionary monetary policy is going to be monetary policy intended to stimulate aggregate demand, also sometimes referred to as monetary stimulus. Likewise, contractionary monetary policy is going to be monetary policy intended to restrain aggregate demand, also sometimes referred to as monetary restraint, where in today's discussion we will focus on expansionary monetary policy, where, as mentioned, the goal of expansionary monetary policy is to stimulate aggregate demand. Thus, the chain of events that we are interested in terms of this objective will be the Federal Reserve increasing the money supply, which has the effect of decreasing the interest rate in equilibrium for the money market, where with the decrease in the interest rate, this increases investment, which then has the effect of increasing aggregate demand, which then increases real output and the average price level in the aggregate product market. Where in terms of how the Federal Reserve can increase the money supply, recall that in terms of their three tools, this means that they can decrease the required reserve ratio, which will increase excess reserves, and increase the money multiplier, which then has the effect of increasing the lending capacity of the banking system. Or they could choose to decrease the discount rate. With a lower discount rate, this incentivizes banks to borrow from the Federal Reserve. Should they go through with borrowing from the Federal Reserve, then bank reserves increase, which then expands the lending capacity of the banking system. Or lastly, the Federal Reserve could purchase bonds in terms of open market operations. By purchasing bonds, consumers and firms are selling their bonds to the Federal Reserve, such that proceeds are going to the bank accounts of consumers and firms, adding to total reserves in the bank, adding to excess reserves, which then expands the lending capacity of the banking system. Now, lastly, in terms of when the Federal Reserve should then use expansionary monetary policy, in terms of our three potential equilibria states for the aggregate product market, in regards to an expansionary short-run equilibrium, expansionary monetary policy would not be wise, in that in this state, the aggregate product market has an inflationary gap in that we're producing above potential real output and we have an increased average price level compared to our targeted average price level, so inflation is a problem. If we were to stimulate aggregate demand further, This would make the inflationary gap worse and make inflation a worse problem than it already is. Now, in regards to our second possible candidate, a long-run equilibrium, our answer is going to be no, in that we are already at our goal of full employment, in that we are at our targeted average price level, and at potential real output. So if the Federal Reserve were to increase the money supply, this would then have the effect of stimulating aggregate demand and putting us in a short-run equilibrium state. More so, a expansionary short-run equilibrium state in which inflation would be a problem. So then this leaves our third possible candidate, a contractionary short-run equilibrium. The answer is going to be yes, in that in this state, the aggregate product market is producing below potential such that unemployment is a problem. Should the Federal Reserve decide to increase the money supply, this would then overall have the effect of being able to close the recessionary gap such that the aggregate product market can return to a long-run equilibrium state. So then, now knowing the chain of events for expansionary monetary policy, how the Federal Reserve can conduct expansionary monetary policy, and that expansionary monetary policy is best used for contractionary short-run equilibrium, let us examine expansionary monetary policy in our ADAS framework. So then consider an economy that's in a long-run equilibrium that experiences a negative demand shock due to a decline in consumer expectations on employment. Initially, the economy will be at a long-run equilibrium at the intersection of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply at point A corresponding to a real GDP level Y star and a price level P star. This economy then experiences a negative demand shock in the form of a decline in consumer expectations on employment. This will have the effect of a decline in autonomous consumption. With a fall in autonomous consumption, consumption will then fall, or with a fall in consumption, aggregate demand will then decline, which we can represent going from AD to AD1. We're holding the price level fixed at P star. This then means real GDP demand in this economy will be by the amount of Y1, where compared to real GDP supplied on the short-run aggregate supply curve corresponding to Y star, we see that there's an excess amount of inventories in this economy. This then sets off a negative multiplier effect, where after the multiplier process has made its way through the economy, we'll then expect a further decline in aggregate demand due to a decline in consumption, taking us from AD1 to AD2. We're holding the price level fixed. This then means that real GDP demand in this economy is now going to be at Y2. After this initial and secondary effect has made its way through the economy, there would then be adjustment to a short-run equilibrium corresponding to the intersection of AD2 and short-run aggregate supply, in which we see the price level is P1 and the real GDP level is Y1, in which we see that the price level has declined and that in terms of real GDP, there's an unemployment gap given that it is below potential. So then what the Federal Reserve can then do to return the economy to a long-run equilibrium is conduct expansionary monetary policy, which we have seen means either decreasing the required reserve ratio, decreasing the discount rate, or purchasing bonds through open market operations, in which we will assume that the Federal Reserve pursues decreasing the required reserve ratio, which will increase excess reserves, allowing more loans to be made, increasing the money multiplier, and overall increasing the lending capacity of the banking system. But before we consider this, let us see the initial state of the money market first and what this means in terms of the economy, where before expansionary monetary policy has been conducted, in terms of the money market, it will be in its initial equilibrium at the intersection of money supply and money demand, in which the initial equilibrium will be R star and the quantity of money will be M star, where this then translates into our inverse investment function with the initial interest rate R star. This means investment in the economy is currently going to be at the level I star, where in terms of our economy, at its short-run equilibrium, this will then correspond to point D at the short-run equilibrium with the price level P1 and the real GDP level Y1. Now, let us suppose that the Federal Reserve conducts its expansionary monetary policy in the form of decreasing the required reserve ratio. As mentioned, this increases excess reserves, allowing more loans to be made. also increasing the money multiplier, which overall increases the lending capacity of the banking system. So the money supply curve will shift to the right from money supply to money supply 1, in which the new equilibrium in the money market will be at the intersection of money supply 1 and money demand, in which we see in terms of the interest rate, this will be R star 1, and in terms of the quantity of money, this will be M star 1, in which we see the quantity of money has increased while there's been a decrease in the interest rate. Where with this decrease in the interest rate, moving on to our inverse investment function, this means downward movement along our inverse investment function to R star 1, where with a decrease in the interest rate, this means an increase in the amount of investment due to the inverse relationship between the two, in which investment is now at I star 1, which we see is greater than I star, where with an increase in investment, what this means in terms of aggregate demand is that there's going to be an increase in aggregate demand taking us from AD2 to AD1. We're holding the price level fixed. This then means that real GDP demand in this economy is now going to be at Y star, where with an increase in investment, this then kicks off a positive multiplier effect in which there will be an increase in consumption taking us from AD1 to AD, and holding the price level fixed at P1. This then means that real GDP demand in this economy will now be at Y3. Then after this initial and secondary effect has made its way through the economy, we will have our adjustment process, where through the adjustment process will then be at the intersection of aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply corresponding to point G, in which the economy is now back at its long-run equilibrium at a Y star amount of real GDP and at the price level P star. So then, with expansionary monetary policy considered, let us now mention some constraints for this tool in the form of a liquidity trap as well as low firm expectations on sales. So, beginning with the liquidity trap, if interest rates are very low, then the Federal Reserve may not be able to return the aggregate product market to a long-run equilibrium, where looking at our money market on the left, interest rates on the vertical, quantity of money on the horizontal, vertical money supply, downward sloping money demand curve, intersection of the two gives us our equilibrium M star and our interest rate R star. Here we see that interest rates are very low, and in terms of how expansionary monetary policy works, shift money supply to the right in order to decrease interest rates so investment increases, stimulating aggregate demand. Here, interest rates are very low already, so there's not a lot of wiggle room in terms of what the Federal Reserve can do in terms of lowering the interest rate. With the interest rate not lowering that much, that means we will not expect a very large response in terms of investment increasing, therefore not a very large response in aggregate demand after we consider the change in investment and the multiplier effect adjusting consumption as well. Therefore, we may not be able to sufficiently change aggregate demand to close our recessionary gap. Likewise, an alternative thing that could occur is that if agents have an elastic response to holding money, then the Federal Reserve may also not be able to return the aggregate product market to a long-run equilibrium, where this corresponds to our money market graph on the right. Where here we have our vertical money supply curve, and here we have the very extreme case of a perfectly elastic money demand curve in which it is horizontal, where regardless of how the Federal Reserve changes the money supply, interest rates will not respond in that how agents are holding their money. With no response in the interest rates, this then corresponds to moving along to our investment response with no change in interest, and that means we would expect no change in our inverse investment function, therefore no stimulus in terms of our aggregate demand curve, therefore we would not be able to return to our long-run equilibrium state given our contractionary short-run equilibrium. Now, lastly, we have low expectations on sales. If firms have low expectations on sales, then the Federal Reserve may be able to adjust the interest rate, but firms may not be able to alter their investment as anticipated in order to return the aggregate product market to a long-run equilibrium. So this requires us to look at both the money market and our secondary step with expansionary monetary policy in the form of investment. We have our initial equilibrium of the money market, R star and M star, where if the Federal Reserve were to increase the money supply, we would have a rightward shift corresponding to a decrease in the interest rate and an increase in the quantity of money in equilibrium. But then when we go to our investment response, here we see we have a pretty inelastic response in terms of our initial inverse investment function values, in that if we started at R star and expansionary monetary policy occurred, it would require a rather large change in terms of interest rates cuts in order to stimulate investment sufficiently to be able to close the recessionary gap, such that if interest rates were also pretty low, the Federal Reserve may not be able to close the recessionary gap due to how firms are perceiving expectations on future sales. So then with these constraints in mind and expansionary monetary policy considered, where we'll pick up at our next video is contractionary monetary policy.